Welcome back to eCoreAcademy, everyone. My name is Anita and I am one of the teachers and co-founders here. As you can see, we have a new Biology 1 episode. I'm so happy and excited to be doing this. In my previous video, you all saw that I had Properties of Water Part 1. That's what we covered. So, as you should have expected, this is going to be the second part. This is going to be Properties of Water Part 2. And specifically in this video, we are going to be doing the following things. We'll understand hydrogen bonds first. So in the last video, I touched on the two types of bonds commonly found with water molecules. One was polar covalent bonds, which are found internally between oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms within a water molecule. And then we mentioned hydrogen bonds, which are found externally between water molecules in a substance. So we're going to be talking about hydrogen bonds now. Then we're going to be talking about two key properties of hydrogen bonds, how they moderate temperature, and properties of ice. Afterwards, we'll be looking at cohesion and surface tension, and then those two go along. And then we have cohesion's opposite, adhesion, and that goes along with capillary action. So that's what we're going to be covering in this video. Before I get into the actual content, I would really appreciate it if you all could hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the post notification bell, drop a comment down below, and share it using our socials. So let's get into the first slide. Like I said, we're first going to talk about what hydrogen bonds are. So hydrogen bond is a weak bond between atoms due to their opposite charges being attracted to one another. So as I'll show you, as I'll reiterate time and time again, I'm in AP Biology now, and our teacher does discuss hydrogen bonds because they occur not only in water, but other macromolecules like DNA. So they are really essential to just different molecules of life. And you'll hear time and time again, teachers in higher level science courses, especially AP Biology and so forth, they'll tell you that hydrogen bonds are not truly bonds. Rather, they're just interactions. It's just two molecules that pass by each other or that are located next to each other that just have a bit of attraction to each other because of these opposite charges. If you remember, we talked about the atom. We learned the principle that opposite charges attract. So if I had a proton in the nucleus and an electron in the electron shell, the electron is attracted to the nucleus and it'll orbit around the nucleus because it's attracted to the proton, which has a positive charge. Because it has the opposite charge, because electrons are negative, protons are positive, so they're attracted to each other. In a similar way, hydrogen bonds occur when there are atoms or molecules. For example, water is a molecule. When there are interactions or attractions between two water molecules in this case, because of opposite charges of different parts of the water molecules. In the last video, we talked about how water is polar. Polar molecules have an unequal electron distribution, meaning one side of the molecule is more electronegative, so it has more electrons, and the other end is more positive. It doesn't have as many electrons as the other end. So if you want to think of it this way, oxygen hogs more of the electrons, takes them away from hydrogen. Hydrogens don't have as many electrons. So if you look at a water molecule, the part of the water molecule with the oxygen is partially negative. And then the part of the water molecule with the hydrogens is partially positive. And that was symbolized by that little squiggly S-looking symbol. That's what indicates partial charge. So that being said, if we look at how that plays a role between two different water molecules being attracted to one another, what happens is a hydrogen bond will form between the hydrogen of one water molecule and the oxygen of another water molecule because, like we said, oxygen is partially negative, hydrogen is partially positive. So the hydrogen atom of one water molecule is going to be attracted to the oxygen atom of another water molecule. That will be a brief interaction, which we call a hydrogen bond because of their opposite charges. So, like we said, involve a polar molecule's negative and positive ends. Remember that there are polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and the hydrogens within one water molecule. This is because although the oxygens and the hydrogens are sharing electrons, the oxygen is keeping two lone pairs, so two sets of electrons to itself. It's not letting the hydrogens even touch those electrons. So that's why, while they are sharing electrons, oxygen is keeping four more electrons to itself. So that's why we get that we get this polarity in the molecule where oxygen is more negative, the part of the molecule with oxygen is more negative, part of the molecule with hydrogen is more positive. So a hydrogen bond pretty much occurs when the oxygen, which is the negative part of the water molecule, interacts with the hydrogen of another water molecule, which is the positive part. Then we have water molecules held together externally due to hydrogen bonds. So like we said, polar covalent bonds are what hold the oxygen and the two hydrogens within a water molecule together. However, hydrogen bonds are what occur when you have multiple water molecules in water, in like liquid, in ice, in gas. So hydrogen bonds, when these single water molecules are brushing past one another and moving past one another, for example, in a liquid, these hydrogen bonds are brief interactions, attractions that will occur between the oxygen and the hydrogen of two separate water molecules. So externally, hydrogen bonds are not found within the water molecule, they're found between two separate water molecules. Like we said before, break and form easily as water molecules glide past one another without separating. They're not really bonds, but they're weak attractions or interactions. So as these as we'll see in ice, these hydrogen bonds are a bit more stiff, so you're not going to see the water molecules gliding past one another. But in liquids, water molecules are more free flowing. So as they move past one another, they'll break these hydrogen bonds, they'll form new ones as they move past new water molecules and leave old water molecules. They glide past one another. And especially as you change state of matter from solid to liquid to gas, you'll see that they're moving faster, they're moving in more area, there's less amount of water molecules in a certain amount of area, there's like a lower concentration of them. So what's going to happen is they're just going to be constantly moving, forming and breaking these hydrogen bonds. Remember, they're not really bonds, they're just attractions and interactions between the oxygen atom of one water molecule and the hydrogen atom of another water molecule. And there are going to be three concepts we learn about today: adhesion, cohesion, and surface tension. And I just want you to keep in mind that all of these have to do with water's hydrogen bonds. So all of these properties we're going to be talking about, they are because of the hydrogen bonds found between water molecules. And these are two good diagrams. They both show hydrogen bonds. I just wanted to show you, this is a space filling model. As you can see, it's almost like these hydrogen atoms are the gray ones are hydrogen, the blue ones are oxygen. It's almost like they're getting eaten up by the oxygen. It's like all squished together. Whereas here you see there's a ball. This is a ball and stick model. This is the oxygen. Then you see a line, a prominent line. Here you don't see that line. A prominent line indicating the polar covalent bond, and then the hydrogen. Here, because they're overlapping, you could already assume that it's a covalent bond, because if they're overlapping, it's almost like their electrons are overlapping, so they're sharing electrons. In this case, you can see this, if you look at this middle water molecule, there's an oxygen, that's blue, and then the two gray atoms are hydrogen atoms. And you can see that the hydrogens have a partial positive charge, that's shown by that like little squiggly S and then the plus sign. And this hydrogen, if you see, it's attracted to the oxygen of this water molecule up here, if you follow my laser, because this water molecule has a partial negative charge. So these opposite charges are attracted. If you come over here to this water molecule, the oxygen, which has a partial negative charge, is attracted to the hydrogen's partial positive charge. And if you just see that, that's exhibited with this diagram. If you come over here, this is also shown. These hydrogen bonds are also shown. As you can see, what they've done is when they drew this diagram, the polar covalent bonds are drawn thickly because those are prominent bonds. Electrons are being shared in those bonds. You'll usually see bonds are occurring because valence electrons between two atoms are interacting. They're either being completely transferred, as in the case of ionic bonds, or they're being shared in the case of covalent bonds. That's why we have that thick line showing that this is a bond, this is a polar covalent bond. However, the hydrogen bonds, as you can see, the hydrogen of this water molecule and the hydrogen of this water molecule are both attracted to the oxygen of this water molecule. They're shown by dashed lines because they're not really bonds. The electrons of this hydrogen are not being shared or given over to this oxygen atom. So they're just brief interactions, brief attractions, because this is a partially positive atom and this is a partially negative atom. That's all about hydrogen bonds, giving you some background information. Now let's talk about a characteristic of water directly related to hydrogen bonds, and this is how they moderate temperature. So first I want to talk about thermal energy. Thermal energy is energy associated with the random movement of atoms and molecules. It is found in hydrogen bonds. So if you think about a substance or just anything, for example, think about liquid water, and you're thinking about the water molecules just moving past one another. They're randomly moving. As they randomly move, they're forming and breaking these hydrogen bonds that they move past, and they glide past other water molecules. And this goes for any atoms and molecules. And this thermal energy is going to be found in those brief hydrogen bonds that they will form with other water molecules before they break them and glide away. So that's what thermal energy is. Heat is caused by thermal energy moving from warmer to cooler parts of the body, and it's needed to break or make hydrogen bonds. Everyone knows what heat is. If you turn on a stove, or you turn on a microwave, or you have a fire, heat is what's given off, and heat is also what's given off during metabolism by an organism. Much of the energy, like the glucose that you break down, that process, a lot of the energy is lost as heat. So heat is pretty much thermal energy. So heat is pretty much the random movement of these atoms and molecules when they move from areas that are warmer to areas that are cooler in your body. And heat is essential for making hydrogen bonds or breaking the hydrogen bonds. And lastly, let's talk about temperature. So temperature is a measure of heat. So it is going to be a measure of how the random movement of molecules are moving from, or are getting kind of propelled from warmer to cooler parts of the body. And it's going to be the average speed of these molecules moving past each other. So, for example, we're looking at a liquid with water in it. As you boil that liquid, obviously the water molecules are going to start moving faster because they're going to be they're going to be spreading apart and evaporating into gas. So you're going to be obviously the speed of the molecules is going to increase. So that's what temperature is pretty much measuring. So one thing you must know is that temperature's got to rise if you want to break the hydrogen bonds in water so water can move faster. For example, in a liquid, there are hydrogen bonds. Of course, the hydrogen bonds are not as stiff as they would be if it was ice, which is a solid, but they're still present. They're still pretty important. If you put water in a pot and you boil it at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to turn into water vapor. So as you add heat, what's going to happen is the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules are going to break and break more until the water molecules get so separated from each other that they just start evaporating and spreading away and spreading as a gas. On the flip side, you have to cool a glass of water. You need to decrease the temperature. You need to decrease the movement of the molecules. In gas, for example, molecules are moving very fast. They're moving past each other. They're breaking these hydrogen bonds very quickly. However, in a solid, in ice, the water molecules don't really move. They're very, very slow. They don't move at all. These hydrogen bonds are very stiff. They're still not bonds, but they're very stiff. And I'll show you exactly how that works on the next slide, but they're stiff. And what happens, how you do that is you decrease the temperature to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, and then water will start to solidify. The hydrogen bonds will become stiffer, and then what happens is, if you have, like, we're going to talk about this on the next slide, but it actually forms a crystal structure. So if I have a bunch of water molecules and they're coming together, they're interacting, and these are the hydrogen bonds. As you decrease the temperature, they're kind of going to form these hydrogen bonds, and they're not going to break. They're not just going to glide past each other and move. They're just going to sit there. They're just going to stay there because the temperature is so cold, so it solidifies the hydrogen bonds. So what happens with water is, if you're heating water up, water will absorb the heat the heat, but while water absorbs the heat, the hydrogen bonds will absorb the heat, but water itself will only heat up a few degrees. I know this is kind of difficult to understand, but it's almost like the hydrogen bonds are absorbing the heat, when you add the heat. So the bonds are absorbing the heat, but the water molecules themselves are not heating up very fast. They'll only heat up a few degrees at a time. That's why water has a pretty high boiling temperature at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. On the flip side, when water is cooled and these hydrogen bonds form, they're going to release the heat that they had when they were heated up. So, for example, if I had liquid in a container and I heated that liquid up, I'm going to have to add quite a bit of heat to get that liquid to become a gas. because the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules in the liquid will absorb so much heat, but the water itself is not going to heat up because the bonds between them are instead just taking all of that heat. It's almost like if you were in battle and you had a bodyguard and the enemy was shooting arrows at you. You can imagine the arrows as the heat and your bodyguard as the hydrogen bond. Your bodyguard might just take all the arrows to himself or herself and protect you. So in a similar way, water is you. The body, I can't believe I'm coming up with this analogy. The bodyguard is hydrogen bonds and the arrows are heat. So the hydrogen bonds are going to take the brunt of the heat, and then water is only going to heat up a few degrees. On the flip side, like we said, if I had that if I had that liquid water and I wanted to cool it down, obviously the hydrogen bonds in liquid water have more heat than the hydrogen bonds in ice. So when I cool it down, what's going to happen is, yes, the hydrogen bonds will become more stiff. It'll become an ice molecule. But as that happens, the hydrogen bonds are going to be releasing heat. So they're going to be releasing that heat they had. And you might be wondering why this is important. Well, that makes water resistant to temperature change. So if I'm heating up a glass of water and it's evaporating, and the hydrogen bonds are absorbing all the heat, the water is barely going to heat up. So it's not going to even want to change the original temperature it was at. On the flip side, if I'm trying to cool water down, yes, the ice cube will form and it'll become cooler, but if the hydrogen bonds are releasing heat meanwhile, that means I'm still not going to get much of a change in temperature. And this is the difference between cities that are beside the ocean versus cities that are in the mountain. And there's actually a YouTube channel and a platform called Bozeman Science, which I use for AP Biology. So, Mr. Anderson, this is really a shout out to you if you ever watch this video. But he helped me understand this concept because he said cities beside the ocean see less temperature fluctuation than cities that are in the mountains. So cities beside the ocean might see about like maybe 60 degrees Fahrenheit all year every month. I mean all year, whereas cities in the mountains might drop all the way to 0 degrees or might go all the way up to 100 degrees because water helps regulate temperature. It'll absorb the heat during the summer so the city doesn't get too hot, and then in the winter it'll release the heat when the city gets cold, and this is all because of the heat stored in hydrogen bonds. Lastly, let's talk about evaporative cooling. So some water absorbs heat from an organism and evaporates to cool the organism, while some water remains to cool down some water remains to cool down organisms. So let me explain what I was trying to get across here. So evaporative cooling is pretty much when you're sweating and your body heat rises, and when that happens, water is going to evaporate, so it's going to become a gas and it's going to evaporate from your body. What happens is when it evaporates, the water that's left behind is cool, and the water that's left behind is supposed to cool your body down after it heats up. As you can see, a good example would be this horse right here. I love horses. That's why I'm using this example. It's sweating like crazy, but what's going to happen is this water will evaporate because of evaporative cooling. It'll evaporate, and then the horse itself whatever water remains will help to cool down the horse after the competition. So continuing on with hydrogen bonds, there are properties of ice that are important because of hydrogen bonds. And this is the fact that ice is less dense than liquid water, meaning ice floats on water. You've probably seen this when you filled up a glass of water, you put ice in, and the ice floats on top. Well, that's the same here. What happens is, I'll explain it, but the structure of ice makes it behave in such a way that usually the solid form of an element or matter is usually more dense than the liquid form of an element and matter, and then it'll sink. So technically, an ice cube should sink in water, but it floats. So why exactly does this happen? So when temperature lowers, hydrogen bonds become stiff and stable, holding molecules at arm's length and making a crystal structure, so a lattice. What happens, like we said, when temperature lowers, the hydrogen bonds are becoming more stiff. But this also means they're becoming more stable. So they're not going to be the water molecules aren't just going to be gliding past each other, breaking and making hydrogen bonds. Instead, the hydrogen bonds are going to become more stiff, they're going to become more solid, and they're just going to be very stable, and they'll hold these molecules at arm's length. So if you're going to think of your friend and your friend's over there and you're just holding your friend, think of the water molecules like holding each other at arm's length because of the hydrogen bonds. What happens is when they assemble in this way, a crystal structure is formed. A crystal structure is also called a lattice. I'll show you. It's like almost like overlying crystal structures. If you think of a snowflake, it's very similar to that. So ice crystals have fewer molecules than an equal volume of water. So if I had 1 liter of ice and 1 liter of water, what this pretty much means is that the 1 liter of water is going to have more water molecules than the 1 liter of ice. That's why, because the liquid water is more dense, because it has more water molecules, the ice is going to float on the liquid water. Liquid ice floats on lakes, keeping them warm and dense. Keeping warm and dense 4 degrees Celsius water below for organisms, or else the lake would freeze throughout. So think of it this way: if ice sank, what would happen to lakes and ecological systems? All the organisms would die because the lake would freeze throughout and freeze over. And what about all the organisms living in that lake? Instead, the fact that ice floats is so essential to life, because ice will float at the top of a body of water, like for example, a lake, and it'll freeze over and it'll create a thin sheet at the top. What happens is, because liquid ice floats on those lakes, because of ice's property of being less dense than liquid water, all of the dense water is dense at 4 degrees Celsius, and it's super warm. All of that dense and warm water is kept at the bottom of the lake to help the organisms survive during the winter. So that's why liquid ice floats on lakes. It's so important. So if you see, these are your water molecules, and then if you see, this is like the crystal structure. This is like a lattice. You see, when you put these together, they form a lattice and they form a box. And then that's why it gets that crystal name, because they all form these crystals. They're all very organized, highly organized. And if you see, they're all an arm's length away. They're not very close to each other. And the hydrogen bonds are all solid lines, showing that even though they're not bonds, they're still very, very strong interactions, and they're all stiff. So the water molecules are not just going to be gliding past one another and breaking these hydrogen bonds easily. And here's just a picture of a lake to show you what it would look like if you don't live in like a colder country, if you've never seen anything like this. The lake actually freezes over, and below this ice is going to be water. It's going to be dense, warm water at the bottom of the lake, and all the organisms are going to survive the winter because of that. So now let's talk about cohesion. And remember, all of this has to do with hydrogen bonds. So cohesion occurs when molecules of the same substance are attracted to another. So attractions between different water molecules. So this again has to do with how hydrogen bonds form. Water molecules are attracted to one another because one water molecule has a partial negative at the oxygen, and then another water molecule has a partial positive at the hydrogen. And these two water molecules are attracted to one another and will form bonds. So that's cohesion. The two water molecules belong to water. They're both exactly the same. They're both water molecules, and they're attracted to one another. So here's an experimental example that I did in class. Our teacher gave us wax paper, and we were supposed to put water droplets on it, and we're also supposed to put oil droplets on it. If you remember from the last video, oftentimes fats, lipids, things like that, they are nonpolar. So the wax paper was nonpolar. The oil droplets were also nonpolar. So like dissolves like is attracted to like. So what happened was the oil got dissolved in the wax paper. However, the water droplets, because they're polar, they didn't want to interact with the wax paper. So when we dropped the water droplets on the wax paper, they just sat on top. They didn't get absorbed. They just sat. They didn't want to get absorbed by the wax paper. When we dropped multiple, they all kind of clumped together because they were attracted to one another. They were more attracted to one another because they're all polar molecules. They were more attracted to one another than they were attracted to the wax paper. Another good example of this is blood. So blood is made of water and other polar molecules, salts, proteins, oxygen, nutrients, all these things we consume in our food. And these are all polar materials. And because they're polar, water is able to dissolve them. And water flows very easily. So with all these molecules dissolved in it, water in the blood is able to move easily because all of these dissolved things are inside of it. However, our teacher told us to imagine, what if blood was made out of oil instead of water? Well, that wouldn't work because it would not be able to flow through the blood vessels like your veins and arteries, because oil has a high viscosity. It's very thick. If you ever seen oil that you use for cooking, it's much thicker than water is. Also, it would not be able to dissolve properly in blood because all these things like salts, proteins, oxygen, nutrients, they're all polar. So these things would not be able to dissolve into oil. So they would all kind of just be mixed up. They'd be thick, high viscosity, and they wouldn't be able to flow with blood through these blood vessels. Another example is trees. So trees depend on the cohesion of water molecules to transport water and other materials from the roots to the leaves. So water is attracted to each other, and trees and other plants have these veins called xylem. So xylem often help water get to different parts of the plant because plants need water for photosynthesis, and we'll talk about that later on. So what happens is the plant will get water from its roots from the ground, from water tables or whatever. We all know that that's how plants obtain nutrients and water. So when they get water, how do they go against gravity? How do these plants push water from their roots to their leaves against gravity? Because remember, gravity is pushing this way. The plant wants to push water upward. So what's going to happen is they're going to have very, very thin veins called xylem, and the water molecules are so attracted to each other so that they'll just keep kind of stacking, they'll keep moving, and they'll eventually get to their destination, which is the leaf. And then when they get to the leaf, after the leaf uses them, and they kind of, if you've ever seen dewdrops, when water is just sitting on top, what happens is when those evaporate, they're pulling they're when one water molecule evaporates, think of it like this is the leaf and the water molecule is kind of leaving the leaf as a gas. Well, the water molecule that's still on the leaf is going to be attracted to the water molecule that's evaporating. So it's almost like the water molecule that's evaporating is going to pull the water molecule that's still sitting on the leaf. So the evaporation of water from the leaf exerts a pulling force on the water within the leaf. So it's going to pull the water from the leaf and it's going to evaporate together. So here's that experiment with the wax paper and the oil and the water I was talking about, and here's the one with the plant and how water moves through the plant. Now we'll talk about strong surface tension. So surface tension is pretty much a skin-like layer that is a result of the strong attraction and cohesion between molecules. So if I fill up a glass of water with if I fill up a glass with water, like you see here, what's going to happen is at the top, if I fill it to the very brim right before it's going to overflow, you'll see that there's almost like a bubble that forms at the top. It's like a skin. You think of it, scientists think of it like a skin-like layer, and this is because water molecules are so attracted to each other that they have their hydrogen bonds are they're so attracted to one another, and their hydrogen bonds are stable enough that it just doesn't break. It's almost like if these are the water molecules almost ready to overflow, they're still so attracted to each other, they're not really willing to break and fall apart and kind of overflow out of the glass. So it's also a measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break a liquid surface. So for example, if I lightly touch that surface on the water, on the glass, it might disturb it a little bit, but I might not break it. If, of course, I just punch my fist into the glass, then obviously the surface is going to break. So water does have strong surface tension, but it's obviously not that strong. Hydrogen bonds contribute to water's strong and high surface tension, making it behave like an invisible film. Like we said on this in this water here, the hydrogen bonds are the attraction, so the cohesion between water molecules. Water molecules are like molecules, so they're attracted to another cohesion. And then the attraction between these water molecules make water's surface, the water molecules at the surface are all very strongly attracted to one another. So they form that skin, and it's very hard to break it. It's hard to break it easily, and it's like we said, invisible film, like a skin. And here's an experimental example that we did in class. So we had a petri dish, I think, and we put water in it, and then we put a paper clip on top. And if we place the paper clip gently on the water, it actually was able to float, even though the paper clip, which was made of steel, its density is 7.8 grams per centimeter cubed, but the water's density is 1 gram per centimeter cubed. And this has a lot to do with polarity, but also mostly has to do with the surface tension. That means even though water is denser, meaning the paperclip should sink to the bottom, the top layer, meaning the water molecules at the top, had such strong cohesion, attraction to one another, that the surface tension, that the surface of the water was so strong it could hold a paperclip. However, the moment you disturb that surface, for example, we dropped one droplet of soap. As soon as the soap hit the surface, it disturbed the surface because the thing is, the soap is polar, the water is polar, and the paperclip are polar. So they're all attracted to each other. So the moment you drop that soap, it'll break the tension, but also the water molecules will kind of be attracted more to the soap than they were to each other at the surface, and they were to the paperclip. So the moment you drop the soap, it's going to break that surface tension, and the paperclip is going to sink. And here are some biological examples that you'll see out in nature. Here's a water strider, and there are other insects like this. They walk on water because they are so light, they actually take advantage of the surface tension. The surface is like a skin. Think of it this way. And these bugs are so light, they're able to just walk over the surface of water, and like we said, overfilling a glass is another example of surface tension. So here's adhesion for you. If you want to think of it, adhesion's like cohesion's cousin. Adhesion occurs when unlike substances cling to one another. So they have an attraction between each other. They're not necessarily forming bonds, but one has a positive, one has a negative charge, and they get attracted to one another. So if you thought about it, cohesion was attraction between similar substances. So similar substance being one water molecule is attracted to another water molecule, as you'll see in the thumbnail of this video and all. However, adhesion occurs when substances like water molecules are attracted to another surface. Like down here, you'll see glass test tubes. Oftentimes, water will form what's called a meniscus, which is a little dip here because the water molecules at both ends of this liquid, like the water molecules over here and the water molecules over here, they're actually attracted more to the glass than they are to other water molecules. So what happens is this is adhesion because one water molecule is attracted to the glass, which is a different substance. So it'll cling to the glass and it'll form this little dip called a meniscus in test tubes. So hydrogen bonds will form between the water and a surface, again, between one of the polar ends of oxygen, and then if the surface has a different charge, then those two will form a hydrogen bond between each other. Like I said, water molecules are attracted to glass test tubes because of this. Adhesion of water to cell walls of cells and plant veins, like we're talking about the xylem. So plant cells have cell walls on the outside. So pretty much you can think of the xylem as being lined by plant cells, all of which are coated on the outside by a cell wall. So the water molecules, think of it just like this test tube with the xylem, with the plant vein. The water molecules are attracted to the cell walls because of adhesion, because of attraction to other substances, and they actually cling to the cell walls and they'll move up the plant. Also, something you'll learn is the thinner the tube or the vein, or the smaller the diameter, the better it can counter the downward pull of gravity. As we talked about, because of cohesion, but also because of adhesion, water is able to move up a plant vein against gravity from the roots to the stems because of cohesion and adhesion. Specifically looking at adhesion, the thinner the diameter of that vein, so the smaller it is, the thinner it is, the better it's able to pull water up from the roots to the leaves, because if you think about it, more water molecules are touching that outer surface, so the plant cell walls, and the more it's going to get adhered to that other surface and move up into the leaves. So lastly, let's talk about capillary action, and this has to do with adhesion. That's why I separated cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion has to do with surface tension, and capillary action has to do with adhesion. Teachers might not talk about this, so I'll go through it briefly, but it is something that is important. So capillary action is the ability of a liquid to flow in narrow spaces without the assistance, or sometimes in opposition, of gravity. So it's how water is able to flow through a narrow space. Like think of a thin test tube or a thin plant vein, like a xylem. It does this without the assistance of gravity. So if you think about it, you're not flipping a test tube like this and having the water flow this way. It'll just spill out of the test tube. Same thing with a plant. You're not taking a plant and then flipping it upside down so that the water can go from the roots to the leaves. It's actually moving against gravity because it's getting attracted to either the sides of the test tube or the sides of that plant vein. So water moves up test tubes in xylem and plants using capillary action. Capillary action is just getting attracted to the sides of the test tube or the sides of the xylem, and it's moving up against gravity. And this again consists of adhesion because the water molecules are attracted to either the glass of the test tube or the plant cell wall of the plant vein of the xylem. Cohesion because the water molecules are attracted to each other. So while the water molecules on the outside, which are actually touching the vein or the glass test tube, are getting pulled upward, they're pulling the water molecules in the middle that might not be in direct contact with that container. They're also pulling each other up, and also surface tension. So the thinner the diameter of the vessel, the more capillary action. So I think a great example would be this test tube here. So as you can see, this is I forget what this contraption is called, but you put a liquid, a colored liquid, usually a liquid that is dyed. And the first test tube, as you can see, is thick, and it gets thinner and thinner until you get to the thinnest test tube. What happened is you put this liquid in here, and you observe capillary action. The test tube up here, the liquid has moved the farthest up in this test tube out here compared to this inner test tube, because this is the thinnest, this is the thickest, so this has the smallest diameter. This is because the thinner it is, like we said before, the more the water molecules can interact with the actual surface, with the actual glass. So the more water molecules are touching the glass, so that'll be more adhesive force, and it'll help it move the water molecules up against gravity. And blood in the vessels and water in the xylem are similar in that they need to move against gravity to get to the heart or leave. So this is like a biological application. This is like us asking, why is this important? Well, it's important because if you think of it this way, arteries move oxygenated blood from the heart through the rest of the body. So it'll push blood to like your toes, all the way down to your toes. What happens when that blood gives up its oxygen and then collects the waste from your toe cells? Well, that blood is going to have to return to the heart to get oxygen again. So what happens is it'll come back to the heart through veins, but if you stand up, it's got to work all the way from your feet to your heart, so it's going against gravity. But because the blood vessels are attracted to the sides, to the vein, to the actual vein, inside of the vein, they're attracted to the sides of the vein. The adhesion is actually able to pull them up against gravity, and then it's actually able to get them back to your heart, similar to plants, how the water molecules move from the roots to the stem through the xylem, like we keep talking about. And that's all I have for the video today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, hit the post notification bell, and share it using our socials. Also, check out our website and email us at our Gmail if you have any further comments, questions, anything you want to share with us. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please look out for Properties of Water Part 3. Bye!